Now, live, go. Live. Is it live? It's doing the little spinny circle thing. Live now. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in for our final class on the book of Numbers. We are in Numbers chapter 31, and we are going to get through the text of Numbers before the end of this class. And if we have time, we can have maybe a little bit of overview at the end, talk about some thematic stuff. I've got this hair hanging down from my head, and it's tickling my nose. I'm going to pull you out. All right. I'm young enough that I can just pull out a hair and not worry about it. Isn't that crazy? Anyway, Numbers chapter 31 is where we are. Numbers chapter 31, we have to, let's give a little background. This is just after the incident at Peor, when Israel was sort of lured away by the women of Moab and Midian to worship the false gods, to worship the gods of the Moabites or the Midianites. It's very odd. Sometimes when the Bible is involving more than one people group, it refers to them by one name and then refers to them by the other name. And the idea is that you piece together that they're talking about a joint group of people instead of just one or the other. This is what happens with, if you remember Joseph back in Genesis, his brothers saw Ishmaelite traders and then they sold him to not Ishmaelites, but the Midianites. So it's kind of weird how it does that. But here we piece it together that the Moabites and the Midianites were colluding together to try and get the Israelites to forsake God as they did at Peor. And this is what the Lord says in response to that. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Avenge the people of Israel on the Midianites. Afterward you shall be gathered to your people." So Moses spoke to the people, saying, "Arm men from among you for the war, that they may go against Midian to execute the Lord's vengeance on Midian. You shall send 1,000 from each of the tribes of Israel to the war." So they were provided out of the thousands of Israel, 1,000 from each tribe, so 12,000 men armed for war. So the Lord commands Moses to execute judgment on the Midianites. We remember the Moabites and the Midianites. They used their women to tempt the Israelites away from the true God, the Lord. And it kind of worked for at least a moment. But the zeal of the man Phinehas, Aaron's grandson, turned the Lord's wrath away from Israel, and so they were not destroyed for what they were doing. Instead, only a number of them lost their lives that time. So God says, you need to get vengeance, or really he says, you will get my vengeance on them. And the idea here isn't that Israel is getting vengeance, but God is getting vengeance using Israel. And that is, we're going to see later when we get into Deuteronomy, that is what God says is the reason why Israel is going to take the promised land. It's not that they are great. It's not that they deserve to have some sort of, absolution over all of these other people, but it is that these other people groups, that is, the ones that were living in Canaan before they came, they were so wicked. That's how Deuteronomy puts it. They were wicked, so God is getting his vengeance on them through the Israelites. And so whenever we talk about the conquest of Canaan, by the Israelites, we need to understand that it's not because Israel was like God's favorite people. He is his special, or they are his special treasured possession among the nations, as he phrases it in Exodus. But it's not because they are so great or better than anyone else. It is that the people who were in the place where he was going to give them, they were just so wicked. And so he used them to get his own vengeance on them. Not their vengeance, but his. And that's something that gets carried over into other parts of the Bible. If you read in the book of Revelation, when it talks about God getting vengeance on the people, those who dwell upon the earth, is how it phrases it. It does not. It brings up the concept of him getting vengeance on them for slaying his holy ones, saints, the people of God, the church. But it doesn't phrase it as the holy ones getting vengeance, or him giving the holy ones vengeance, but him getting his own vengeance because of what they did to his holy ones. So when we talk about the judgment day, it's something that all humans are going to be subject to, and it's not something that we have any special privilege regarding, other than the fact that Christians have been justified by the blood of Christ. And so we are not going to be judged by our track record, but by the Christ's track record, which is fortunate because he did not sin, right? Hebrews chapter 2. Anyway, that's a good tangent to go off on. So the Lord commands Moses to execute judgment on the Midianites for him, and 1,000 men from each tribe are armed and sent to the war. And I find it interesting, the use of the definite article, the. It says the war instead of just sent to war. It almost implies that war was not meant to be a perpetual or regular thing for God's people to be engaged in, as it was for the other nations. We have other nations like Assyria. They were a nation built on the theological philosophy that if they ever stopped conquering, the world would end. Not even joking, that's what they believed. And so they were always at war. Or Babylon. Babylon was always trying to subjugate more people. They were always at war. Persia was always trying to expand. They were always at war. Rome, of course, was also always at war. And so all of these other nations that do things, just the way of the world, it results in war being an either perpetual or regular thing. Just something that's kind of routine. Hey, we have, if it's not perpetual, they say, okay, well, we haven't gone to war for a while, so now it's time to expand, let's go to war. And it results in a terrible thing, but for war to become so common and so much of a regular thing for nations to do, it becomes something that people just expect. We can almost not even imagine a world where nobody is fighting. We very often we can't imagine a world that doesn't have conflict in it, and it's because war, for almost all of human history, has been something that has always been done. And just because something has always been done doesn't mean it should be done. But that is how the world's history has gone. But for God's people, it seems, it was not supposed to become a perpetual or regular thing, or at least that's the implication that I'm getting from the exact words that are being used. Instead of saying, send them off to war, he says, send them off to the war. And we're going to see in Deuteronomy that kings were not allowed to have standing armies in Israel, or at least they weren't supposed to, according to God's rule book. And so war was not primarily to be one of the things that that Israel was supposed to be interested in. Now, it's not that they were sent to or armed for war, but for the war. Now, along with them was Phinehas. We see in Numbers chapter, well, again in chapter 31, but I forget where it exactly mentions that he came along. But along with them goes Phinehas. He's the one who was commended for his zeal for God that turned away God's wrath at Peor. That's back in chapter 25, verse 11. And the end result also brings another familiar face back into the narrative. There are these 5 kings of Midian. Their names are Evi, Rechem, Zur, Hur, Reba, and they're all killed in the fighting. But another man is killed in the fighting, and it is our old acquaintance, Balaam. Balaam is killed at some point in this conquest of Midian. It gives the impression that God is intent on making sure that the guilty receive justice one way or another. He had given Balaam a stern warning when he sent his angel to intercept Balaam on the way to where Israel was, that he is not to say anything negative about Israel, that he is not to curse Israel, and that he is to do just and only just what the Lord tells him to do, and to say only just what the Lord tells him to say. Now we learn, I forget exactly where we learned it, but yes, okay, yeah, we're going to run into that. We learn in verse 16 that Balaam is the one who came up with the plan that happened at Peor, that the Moabites and the Midianites would use their women to lure, coax, attract the Israelite men away from the God of Israel. Firstly, by attracting them away from staying within their nation, and then to attract them to serving their gods, and thus turning the Lord's wrath upon them. And he pays for it. So now that the battle is fought, it's really like not a whole lot of verses are devoted to this incident where the Midianites get all but wiped out. They'll be back, later in the book of Judges, but for now, they're now few and far between. But now that that is done, there is the question of what to do with everything, because what results war yields. Yeah, there's a lot of loss of life, but there's the spoils, right? There's everything that you win when you win a war. So from verse 13 onward, there is the question of what are they going to do with everything? The war party returns with the spoils and with captives, but Moses goes out and meets them, and he's really angry. He's really angry, but why? He says, "Have you let the women live?" The women? What about them? This is like one of the spoils of war kind of thing. You would go off, you fight the men, and if you win, the men are dead, so you take the women and you kind of induct them into your nation, pretty much, into your families. And he says, "Have you let the women live?" Well, were we not supposed to? He says, "Behold," verse 16, "these, on Balaam's advice, caused the people of Israel to act treacherously against the Lord." Oh, they're the guilty party. And God is intent on the guilty party to receiving its justice, its just rewards. So he reminds them the Midianite women are guilty because of the part that they played at Peor. So they cannot stay. They cannot be brought into the nation of Israel. The captured men and boys cannot stay either. Men were traditionally not just the people who were supposed to fight in the armies, but they were traditionally the religious leaders of their families. There would be community religious leaders like a priest, a shaman or sorcerer or whatever, talking about pagan nations. But every head of the household, who is always a man, right, would be the religious leader for his individual family too. And so God says they're not staying. We're not having that in amongst the congregation of Israel. So he says they've got to go. They cannot be taken in as the spoils of war. But one group of people is allowed to stay, and that is, the Bible phrases it as the virgin women. Now, some translations say the young women, but that is because the word virgin can also mean young woman. So because of the stipulation that it also gives, the extra qualifier, it says, who have not known a man, we're going to say virgin, right? So the virgin women were allowed to be kept, but remember, even then, there was a very strict regulation that granted them protection. This is found in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 10 through 14. Let's see it here. This is one of the ways that Israel was really revolutionary, not because of their own wisdom, but because of God's wisdom. He says, when you go out to war against your enemies, and the Lord your God gives them into your hand, and you take them captive, and you see among the captives a beautiful woman, and you desire to take her to be your wife, and you bring her home to your house, she shall shave her head and clip her nails. And she shall take off the clothes in which she was captured, and shall remain in your house, and shall mourn for her father and her mother for a whole month. After that, you may go into her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. But, verse 14, if you no longer delight in her, you will let her go. You will let her go wherever she wants to go. But you shall not sell her for money, nor shall you treat her as a slave, since you have humiliated her. What is this talking about? Well, I'm sure you're not extremely surprised by this, but it was a very common thing, not just in the ancient world. I mean, this has been going on up until probably the end of the 16th century, where an army would go, they would fight, and if they win, they would take the spoils. And like I said, those spoils would involve women, and they would take the women home, marry them. If no family was going to pay a ransom for them, they would marry them, or they would make them slaves. And God says, you will not make them slaves. That's number one. Number two, if you are going to marry her, you need to go through this process first. Think about it. She has to shave her head. That's one of the most traditionally considered to be attractive aspects of women. If their hair looks good, she shaves her head. What about her nails? She clips her nails. What about her nice clothes? She changes into normal clothes. And she is there for a whole month. And you're not allowed to touch her that whole month. Instead, it's a period for her to mourn her father and her mother. Then, after that month, if you still love her, then you can marry her. But after all of that, if you found, maybe I don't actually love this woman, maybe it was just a moment of stupid passion on my part, you let her go. You don't marry her, you don't keep her, because she's not yours, you let her go. That is a degree of protection that no other nation ever gave to any woman in the ancient world. Like I keep saying, Israel, because of the law of Moses, was a revolutionary kind of society. No one else had that kind of law. No one else had anything like that. No one else had protection for women like that, especially not women who were captured because of war. Those are the kind of people that you would say, why should we grant them protection? They're the spoils of war. But Israel had those protections for them because God still cared about them because they were people. But also, back in Numbers chapter 31, the army, before coming back into the midst of the congregation, they must cleanse themselves and their captives and all the spoils. Everyone likes to win. Everyone likes to take the spoils of war, right? But God makes it clear war is still war and death is still death. Remember what we talked about in Leviticus? Death can't exist in God's presence. And things related to death can't exist in God's presence. Things tainted by death can't either. And so that's why there's all the cleanliness laws. That's why there's the process for cleansing oneself if they touch a dead body, So the army, their captives, everything that they're bringing in from the spoils of war, it's all tainted and it needs to be cleansed. War is still war and death is still death. And God's holiness is still God's holiness. So the loot then, once it has been cleansed, is split between the warriors, we'll call them the warriors, and the congregation of Israel. And a tribute is also set aside and offered to the Lord. And so even in war, a context that was mainly take all you can and do whatever you want kind of setting, Israel had to remember and obey the Lord along each step of the way. Even in the process of, the spoils of war. They weren't allowed to just do whatever they want, even in the context of war. So in verse 32, after this, we have had the Amalekites pushed out of their land, and the Midianites pushed out of their land, and the Moabites pushed out of their land, and so now there's this huge amount of land on the east side of the Jordan, the not promised land side, that is empty now, but it is all still good land. And so in Numbers chapter 32, the tribes of Reuben and Gad, the tribes of Reuben and Gad, they have too much livestock to keep going. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like a familiar thing to have happen in the Bible? Catherine's nodding her head. I'm thinking of Abraham and Lot. They had too much livestock to go on in the same place as each other, to go on living together. And they had to split up. And as we know, a lot of bad things happened to one of them because they split up. And so if you are remembering that part of the Bible, this is raising a red flag. And it should. This is going to raise a red flag for you because Reuben and Gad are saying, we have too much livestock, and now look, over on this side of the Jordan is so much open land. It's all good stuff here. Let's settle here. They make a request that Moses and Eleazar let them settle here on this side of the Jordan instead. This is the exact same region that Lot settled in when he split up with Abraham. That's another exact connection to that part of the Bible that this makes. It's the exact same place, the same region. So they make that request, hey, let us settle here. And Moses he makes it pretty clear. He is very much against it. He reminds them of the last time that Israelites refused to enter the promised land. Do you remember the last time that happened? That was Numbers chapter 13. When the spies were sent in and they brought back the negative report, and Israel said, you know what, we're not going to trust God on this one, so let's not go in. And God said, this whole generation's going to die in the wilderness because of that. Moses says, don't you remember the last time that Israelites refused to enter the promised land? It was horrible. An entire generation of our people died because of that. And he warns them, if you refuse to go in, this whole people will be destroyed because of you. So Reuben and Gad commit to obeying the Lord, but they still want to live here. They still want to live on that side of the Jordan. They vow to fight alongside the other tribes until everyone comes to possess their part of the inheritance, but their place will be on this side of the Jordan. They won't let, and the idea is they will not let a geographic border stop them from following the Lord. And that's a very big commitment, especially we call it dispensations, right? The Mosaic dispensation, the Christian dispensation. In this form of following God that they were given, geography plays a big part because they have to go to the tabernacle wherever it is to offer sacrifices to the Lord. So being on the other side of this big river is a pretty big thing. So geography could very well keep them from obeying the Lord, and they make the vow that to never let it do that. That's a very big commitment. And so we get the sneaking suspicion that they're not going to live up to it, and that comes up in the book of Joshua, whether or not they're going to really live up to it. But until that point, you're kind of like, ooh, I don't know, this is kind of precarious now, where things are getting off the rails again. But the Lord says, as long as they keep that promise, it may be so. It may be so. Let them settle here as long as they keep that promise. If they don't keep that promise, I'm going to wipe them out. But as long as they do, it's fine. As long as they do what God says, they keep their promise to the Lord, it's okay. It doesn't matter where they're going to live. So after that, we have Numbers chapter 13. And Numbers chapter 13 is really just Moses recounting Israel's journey so far. There's a lot of just naming the locations that they stayed at. Moses recounts the list of everywhere where they camped. And oh boy, what a list it is. It goes from all the way from the first stop they made after the Passover night back in Egypt, and all the way up until the last stop that they made, and I don't even remember where it is. It's at like the very end. It doesn't matter the last stop they made. It's just where they are. And how many locations is actually in this list? There are actually 42 locations in this list, and minus if you subtract Succoth and Etham, and those are the first two stops that they made, which both of them are before they get to the Red Sea. So it's actually technically before they left Egypt. They stopped at those two places. How many places are left in the list? What do you know? 40. You know, the Bible has these recurring numbers, and one of them is right here. There were 40 places in the wilderness where Israel stopped before they were to cross over into the Promised Land. Pretty interesting. Like we mentioned before, like way before, the number 40 is meaning sort of a time of change, a time of transition, I guess, between one distinct sort of era to another. And by era, I just mean like a span of time that was characterized by one thing. The number 40 pops up a lot in the Bible. One of them, I can't, the first one that comes to my mind is Jesus spending 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness fasting and praying. And that is the transition time between before his ministry and into his ministry, 40 days. And I can probably think of other ones if you want to just catch me on Sunday and ask for more 40s in the Bible. But there you go. 40 locations, definitely trying to say that this was a time for transitioning between these two distinct times. That was Israel, God's people, was in slavery in Egypt, and then they're going to be brought into the promised land. It is the transition between God's promise being unfulfilled thus far to God's promise being fulfilled. And that is a pretty important transition. His promises made to Abraham, that is. And then starting in verse 50, and this goes on into chapter 36, I think. Moses wants to get it across, the message that there is a great deal of effort that this generation is going to need to make in the following years. You know, Israel is told to drive out the inhabitants of the land, destroying all forms of idolatry from the land, and they're told not to leave any of it. You know, they are erasing what should not have existed. Does that sound kind of right? That's what they're going for? Erasing what should have not existed in the first place. Some people would make the point that, well, this is like those nations' culture. I mean, culture is one thing, but sin is another. And sin was not supposed to exist in the first place. God says, wipe out all the idolatry in this land. You're not going to have it living among you. And in that same vein, you're not going to have these people living among you either, because they are going to turn you to the idolatry. So don't let them live among you either. In chapter 34, God says, here's your boundaries. He's going to lay out what the boundaries of the promised land are going to be. It's not all over the world. It's just this portion of land in the what do you call that part of the world? The sort of Mediterranean region. And it is a lot of land, actually, for that many people. It's a good bit of land. The south side, the southern border, was to be the southern desert, all the way to the Brook of Egypt. Earlier translations, I'm thinking probably King James, says River of Egypt, but that is because there are multiple words in Hebrew and in other Semitic languages to mean a flowing body of water that are not a river. And so later translations say Brook of Egypt, but earlier translations say River of Egypt, earlier English translations, that is. And so that's led a lot of people to believe that the Brook of Egypt is the Nile River, which is incorrect. They were never supposed to have land all the way up until the Nile River. That is literally in the middle of Egypt, and God told them, don't ever go back to Egypt. Instead, the southern border of the Promised Land is a place known as the Wadi El Aresh. I probably mispronounced that. It might be El Aresh, but it is at Succoth. That is the last place where they were before they got to the Red Sea. And that is generally accepted as where the southern border of the Promised Land was supposed to be. Whether or not they actually got that far in conquering the Promised Land, that's another thing to discuss. They might have under Solomon. That's a whole different conversation. Why they never conquered all of the Promised Land like they were supposed to. But the north side, the border is formed by Mount Hor. That is one of the mountains on the northern part of the land of Israel. It still serves as one of the natural borders for Israel now, I believe. And Mount Hor borders between Israelite territory and the Hittite territory back in the ancient world. And it is also the region where the beloved, not the man beloved, but the female beloved in the Song of Solomon is from. She is from Mount Hor. She is from that region, which is like usually by Israelites is considered like a backwater kind of country bumpkin kind of area because it's so far away from all of the big cities in the middle of the country, right? And on the east side, of course, the west border is formed by the shoreline, right? But the east side is from Mount Hor down to the Sea of Kinnereth, which is the Sea of Galilee, and down all the way down to the Dead Sea by the way of the Jordan River. Now, if you have a map in front of you and you trace all of those boundaries, you will detect that it cuts out a big portion of the territory that Israel actually comes to occupy, and that is all of that land that was on the east side. If you're going by these borders, it's not the Promised Land, that side of the river, and so it continues to raise the red flag, like, hey, this is something that we might need to pay attention to. This is something that we might expect to have things go off the rails, to go awry. We got to keep an eye out on these tribes that are settling on the east side of the Jordan. In chapter 35, God lays out the cities of the Levites. The Levites were to receive 48 cities. 6 of them were to be the cities of refuge. So the cities of refuge, if you accidentally killed someone, it's an incident of not murder, but manslaughter, which I've always thought that's a weird thing because it's not as bad as murder, but it sounds worse, manslaughter. But if you commit an act of manslaughter, you've killed someone accidentally, you could flee to a city of refuge, and the avenger, the person from the unfortunate dead man's family, would come and try and get revenge on you to avenge the memory of their family member. And if you were in the city of refuge, then the elders of the city of refuge would look into the matter and see if it was an accident or was, you're just lying and saying it was an accident, but it's actually murder. And so if it was an accident, then they would reach out to that person and they would say it was completely an accident. They are terribly sorry. Will you stop trying to kill them? And if they will not stop trying to kill them, then, well, I'm sorry, but you live in the city of refuge forever now, for the rest of your life. But if they will, then you go back home, and hopefully they weren't lying about it. But of course, if it was not accidental and you just went to the city of refuge and lied about it being an accident, then when the investigation finds out that it was not a lie, or that it was not accidental and you just murdered a person, they throw you out, and that person gets their family revenge on you as per the law. I'm running out of time, so chapter 36. I'm just having a good time talking about it, Chapter 36. That special case comes up again. The daughters of Zelophehad. Fun names, right? I should make Mike read these. The daughters of Zelophehad, and the solution let them, or sorry, I got to bring up what this matter actually is. They inherited their father's inheritance. That's weird. They inherited their father's portion of the promised land because their father died without sons. And they said to Moses, you know, we've been thinking about it, and we inherited this land, but if we marry a man, you know, because women marry men, that land becomes theirs. And then when we die, that family possesses the inheritance, and our father has no more inheritance again in his name. What do? So Moses inquires of the Lord, and the Lord says, let them marry within their clan and within their tribe, so that when they pass away, their kinsmen will still be in their father's clan. Easy enough, right? And so that made the precedent for tribes to only marry within their own tribes, so that no land changes between the tribes. That's something that went on in Israel. But fortunately, the tribes of Israel were large enough so that inbreeding never actually became an issue. That's a good thing, right? So there is no way then for any tribe to swallow up another tribe's land. You know, it's the ways of nations and kings to marry into other families and bring other people into their family for the purpose of gaining more land. And God makes the command that there's no way for that to happen. The land belongs in that tribe. The tribe marries within itself, and you don't get the land from that tribe. If you're from the tribe of Judah, you can never have any land that is in the tribe of Benjamin. And if you're, you know, it goes on like that. And so that again, like in Leviticus, we saw that the last part of it was kind of this weird, it sort of felt like a weird place to leave off. But this is where Numbers leaves off again. So that happens twice. But it sort of delivers the final message that God is taking them into the promised land, and he is very intent on making sure that they all have a part of the promise. He is faithful in that he is making sure that they all have a part of the promise as long as they are remaining faithful to him. So I said that we were going to have a little thematic overview at the end, but I guess we're out of time for that. But I'll leave it off with this. The book of Numbers covers a span of 39 years and tells the story of Israel's epic trek through the promised land. It's not 40 years, but it's 39 because the first year happened before the book of Numbers. Nearly every step of the way, Israel rebels against God. But also every step of the way, God shows his faithfulness and care for them. He cared for them when they were hungry and when they were thirsty and when they were in danger, when they needed saving from the deadly snakes, when they needed protection from Balaam's curses. He protected them, he saved them, he fed them, he gave them water, he prevented their clothes from wearing out and their sandals from wearing out while they walked. And while they complained about everything, they never didn't have what they needed because God cared about them and he was faithful to them. And so now at the end of the book of Numbers, in the plains of Moab, this new generation of Israelites is waiting to cross over the Jordan, to fulfill the Lord's command to take the land that was promised to them so many generations ago. But first, though, Moses has a final message for them before he dies, because he was told because he rebelled as well, he was not going to enter the promised land. So he has one final message to give them before he passes on. And that is what the book of Deuteronomy is going to be about. That's what we're going to get into next week. Isn't it neat how the Bible always leads into the next part? It's a continuous narrative. It's not, when you're a kid and you start reading this, if you did start reading it when you were a kid, it feels like it's disjointed because, you're in Sunday school and you get taught probably about Jesus first, and then you get taught about Noah and the ark and about Moses and it's all these disjointed stories to a kid, but it is one continuous narrative. It is one continuous story that all finds its culmination in Jesus. And that's a remarkable thing that would be a remarkable thing to find in anything like that is so big as the Bible. But it is a truly remarkable thing because it shows that the Bible is harmonious, that it has a continuous point at which it was going towards, and to which it is now pointing everyone towards in the future. It's remarkable. So that is it for tonight. Thank you for joining us again for our class in Numbers. Like I said, this was the final class in the book of Numbers, and next week we're going to start the last book of the 5 books of Moses, that is Deuteronomy. Hope to see you then, and I hope everyone stays safe and stays healthy. God bless you all.